We start today with your money. More than 14 billion US dollars in emergency funding to back Israel's war on terrorists and rescue hostages, including Americans. The House voted to send it and pay for it by diverting the money that would have funded Internal Revenue Service improvements. And that left South Florida Democrats with a tough decision. And all but one joined Republicans in voting yes. But the Senate has said, forget it, dead on arrival. So now what? That is where we start with one of our local congressmen who holds the power of the purse as an appropriator. Mario Diaz-Balart here with us live via Zoom. You're kind of a regular. I'm liking this, Congressman. Good morning.
Well, thank you, Glenna. A lot is happening in D.C. these days.
A lot is happening in D.C. with such resonance in South Florida, and that's what we talk about. And so to start that off, you considered this aid package, so many considered this aid package, critical emergency funding, and including South Florida Democrats. 12 Democrats voted for this, including South Florida's, but for one. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, your colleague, was one of those Democrats. However, while voting for it, she called it, I'm going to quote her here, a gross politicization and unprecedented conditioning of aid to Israel. How do you hear that?
Well, look, it received a bipartisan support in the House, and this is what the bill does. It funds exactly what Israel is asking us to fund, that they need urgently. It's exactly what it funds. Now, I guess the controversial part for some is that as opposed to just borrowing money, adding this to the deficit and then basically borrowing the money from China and having to pay interest on that money, we're trying to actually reduce spending someplace else in order to pay for this. I don't think that's that complicated of an issue. One could argue that maybe it's not the ideal place, or it is the ideal place to cut in order to not have to borrow more money from China. But the concept, I think, is a great one. We're funding Israel exactly what they need and what they've asked for. And we're trying not to just add to the deficit. We're looking at ways to cut spending elsewhere. In this case, cutting almost 90,000 additional IRS bureaucrats, which have not been hired, shouldn't be hired. I think that's a pretty good trade-off between having to borrow more money from China and having to pay interest on that money, or let's not hire almost 90,000 more IRS bureaucrats in order to pay for this. That's the entire controversy.
So that the IRS funding was politics from the start. We've actually talked about it last year when this had bubbled up. For two questions on that account. How did that pot of money get to be the one? Aside from borrowing from China, I'm sure there's probably a lot of other options too. So part A, why IRS funding? Whose idea was that?
Yeah, I mean, Glenna, I think there are other places that we can look for. And if you look at my state foreign ops appropriation bill that passed the House, you see that we found other places to cut wasteful spending. But here's the reality. There's a big chunk of money that hasn't been spent that is programmed to hire almost 90,000 additional IRS bureaucrats. And we believe that we shouldn't be doing that in the first place, that's going to hurt the taxpayers, particularly small businesses and families. So it's a great place to not waste money and use it for something that's an emergency, which is this money for Israel. Now, are there other places?
Before you go on, hold on. I have a question before you go on that account. I read the analysis by the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, bipartisan. Their analysis of that, they don't call it 90,000 bureaucrats. They call it modernization that would actually decrease the deficit in the long run, because modernizing and technology at IRS allows them to go after tax cheats and bring in more money. So that's what the sort of facts say on the analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Only in Washington are 90,000 additional bureaucrats called modernization. Only in Washington.
So IT is not part of that? Technology?
IT is a small part of that, but it's 90,000, I think it's 89,000 new IRS bureaucrats. And only in Washington is that called modernization. And by the way, or called savings, which is absolutely insane. Look, I'm not new at this. You have to have a little bit of common sense when you're dealing with Washington. And I think common sense and the American people know that if you hire an additional 90,000 bureaucrats in the IRS, number one, they are there forever. You're never going to be able to get rid of them. It's going to continue to increase cost, and calling that efficiency or modernization is only a reality that can happen in the vivid imagination of other bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
So how do you go after those tax cheats and get all that money back?
We're doing that already. And what this is meant to do, and by the way, we've seen reports saying this, is to go after small businesses and families and family farms in particular, and again, individuals in small businesses. This is not to go after the big corporations, which, by the way, we need to make sure that they pay their fair share. This is to go after, again, to audit additional families, small businesses, individuals, and again, at a huge cost to the taxpayer. The theory is that they're going to be able to find enough money going after small businesses and individuals and families in order to make up the cost to hire 90,000 more bureaucrats. Again, common sense will tell you it's not true. But again, we can say that maybe we should look for other places. I've done that effectively, looking for other places to cut spending. But we needed to find it quickly. That money has not been spent yet. And we need to make sure that Israel gets everything it needs. And by the way, I expect that this won't be the only time that we're going to have to help Israel to deal with this war against terrorists.
So that's an open question, absolutely. I want to, Congressman, another huge international news that is huge local news this week that I don't think we've given enough attention to here was what happened with the elections in Venezuela. There was sort of this local news about the Biden administration's deal to loosen sanctions on oil sanctions on Venezuela and the Maduro regime in return for election monitoring and fair elections. That kind of was heralded as a breakthrough deal by some. And then it appears this week that Maduro reneged on that. Your observations there.
I warned the administration publicly, privately, and even in writing that it was a ludicrous idea. You don't relax sanctions hoping that Maduro will have free elections. You keep sanctions and you pressure until they have free elections. So, by the way, I'm demanding already, and I've had multiple conversations with this administration, that they snap back those unilateral sanction relief that they gave the Maduro dictatorship. It was in oil and in gold. By the way, the only beneficiaries are the allies of Iran and Russia and China, and obviously our enemies. But this administration, the Biden administration, their decisions have been so erroneous, so naive since the beginning, that we should not be surprised that the world is up in flames. It's falling apart around us. A big part of that is because of the frankly ridiculously naive or irresponsible foreign policy of the Biden administration.
Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, great to have you for our short time together on this Sunday, and we absolutely will be watching what happens with the funding and the foreign policy as we go forward this week. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Glenna.